Hi, and thank you for joining me for this presentation on Midi Recording. I'm Bill Pere, author of Songcrafters Coloring Book, president of the Connecticut Songwriters Association, and the director for the Connecticut Songwriting Academy. This presentation will be an overview of Midi, then an example of a MIDI-produced song, and then a look at different kinds of MIDI instruments that are available to you. My objective here is to make you aware of the vast array of choices that a MIDI system gives you in recording and arranging your music. In the space of this short video, it's not going to be possible to show you a step-by-step of how to do all the things that we're going to talk about, and also the actual step-by-step process would vary somewhat among different types of MIDI setups and different types of software. So what I am going to do is give you an overview of what is possible with a MIDI system, and even though different systems may have different ways to get from A to B, the underlying principles are the same. Like many singer-songwriters, when you finish a song, you may hear in your head all kinds of wonderful orchestration, and then you find yourself without the means to hire musicians and provide them with properly written sheet music and a way to record all the necessary tracks and a way to make corrections and adjustments after the fact, and far short of the budget you need to achieve what you want. Thus, so many recordings are limited to guitar, bass, keyboard, with maybe light percussion and perhaps a splash of a solo flute, violin, or whatever might be available, even though in your head you might want a lot more. But MIDI makes the world of all sounds available to you without limit, without budget constraints, and performed with world-class precision. Once you have a MIDI system set up, you can truly ask yourself, what do I really want this song to sound like? Whether it's the big brass of Chicago, or the lush orchestras of the Moody Blues or Jimmy Webb, or totally techno, or modern hip-hop, or heavy metal, anything you want, it's all within your reach. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It was about 40 years ago, in the early 1980s, all the music equipment manufacturers got together and agreed on a universal standard that allowed any device from any manufacturer to communicate with any other device by simply connecting them with a MIDI cable or then eventually through USB. This quickly led to an explosion of different sound devices and instruments and computer software to make use of this development. Building music tracks with MIDI was called sequencing, where you are not recording sound, but instead you're recording performance data. There are three main parts to a MIDI system. First, there's the MIDI-enabled instrument that you play or any other input device, and this is called a controller. Second, there's the MIDI sequencer software, which lets you then edit the performance data in a virtually unlimited way. There are also standalone sequencers, but they may have more limited editing capabilities. The greatest power of MIDI lies in the depth and ease of the editing functions. Third, you need a sound source, because remember, when you're recording MIDI, you're not recording sound, you're recording performance data. So you need a sound source. Usually that's a standalone module, or a sound card in a computer, or sounds that are built into a keyboard or other instrument. When connected together, MIDI software on a computer can see everything like this, all the different components of the MIDI system. It knows what sounds are available in each sound module, like this, and you can easily select them and switch among them. So in real time, you can, as something is playing, you can flip between different sounds and hear what it sounds like until you find just the right thing that you're looking for. Now, there are many different MIDI programs, but I use Digital Performer by Mark of the Unicorn, and that's what I will be using in this presentation. Your choice of components for your system is up to you. There's no right or wrong. Just be wary of components that claim to be all-in-one solutions, as it can be the case that if it does everything, it may not do each thing particularly well. Sometimes it's better to have several individual components, each dedicated to a particular thing that it was designed primarily to do. That's your choice. I think ultimately the latter is more cost effective because in the long run the components last, and if one goes down you don't lose the other ones, whereas if it's all in one, if one thing goes down, they all go down. Now, when you plug a MIDI-enabled instrument, which can be a guitar, a keyboard, a violin, a trumpet, or essentially any type of instrument, into a MIDI system, and you hit record, you can hear what you are playing in, any sound you want, but no sound is recorded. Instead, what's being recorded is the performance. It's capturing 5 main things: the notes you play, what beat they are on, how loud they are, how long they last, and any related aspects of expression. That is, does a note bend, does it slide, does it have reverb, does it pan left or right, etc. Another great thing about MIDI recording is mistakes don't matter. Rhythmic imperfections don't matter, because once recorded, and believe me, it will record all your mistakes with great precision, but once recorded, you can then edit every, and I do mean every, aspect of the data to make it exactly what you want it to be. You can adjust notes, rhythmic placement, volumes, note length, expression, etc. Every aspect of the performance is totally within your control. You can transpose keys, and most importantly, you can make the track sound like any instrument you want. If you record it using a guitar, you can play it back to sound like a violin, a flute, a French horn, a synth, or whatever sounds you have in your sound modules, including sounds that you may sample yourself. While this concept of recording performance data rather than sound may seem a bit abstract to some artists, you can think of it this way. In film, when an actor is outfitted with motion sensors in front of a green screen, what is being recorded is not a video image of anything, but instead it's the data that corresponds to the movement. Then that data is edited and linked to whatever images the director wants to create what you see. It's the visual equivalent of what you can do with MIDI and sound. To make this more clear, let's take a look at the difference between recording MIDI and recording actual sound. Now, this is a bass guitar track of digital audio. It is the actual sound waves. This is typically what you would record on a digital audio workstation. If you expand it, if you expand the track, you still see sound waves, just more granular. And you can expand it as much as you want, it's still going to look like sound waves. And that's what you have to work with. Now, you can do a lot with that, but it is limited. Now, let's look at the same bass guitar track with MIDI data. If you expand it, you see actual musical information. You can look at it in at least 3 different ways, and this musical information corresponds to what you played. It's the performance that you played on the guitar. So this gives you a choice as to how you prefer to interact with the data. You can see actual music notation, and if you're comfortable with that, you can do editing like that. Or you can see a list of events on each musical beat, the notes, the volumes, the length of time, the expression, and you can edit it that way. That happens to be my preferred way of doing it, although that's probably not the way that most other people do it. You can also look at it a third way, and that is a graphic representation of notes along the vertical axis and time along the horizontal axis with expression data underneath. In any of these views, you have total edit control over every minute detail. You can correct any error, add, remove things, basically do anything you want to enhance and alter the performance and adjust it the way you want it to be. When MIDI was first introduced, what emerged quickly was a lot of techno-sounding sequenced songs in the 1980s and early 90s, and a lot of dance music. This was not unexpected, as that was a very easy way and obvious use of MIDI, but MIDI could do so much more. In 1984, I converted my studio to focus on MIDI production, but with an ear toward more natural orchestrations. This was an opportunity for independent singer-songwriters who wanted to have nicely orchestrated, full-sounding recordings, but who lacked the budget and connections to do so, realize their goals. I've been doing that for almost 40 years. Since its heyday in the 1980s, MIDI has faded into the background, overshadowed by the advent of digital audio workstations. This is the result of several factors. First, MIDI does have a learning curve, and that can be a barrier for some who are not technically inclined, but that is circumvented by finding a good MIDI producer to work with, as long as you have your musical vision in your head. The whole beauty of MIDI is that it lets you take whatever you have in your head and make it real. Or you can just dig in and climb the learning curve. You'll be glad that you did. When I made the decision to focus on MIDI, I basically took 2 years off from other musical endeavors, and I just focused on that, and I learned it up and down and backwards and forwards, and it has been the most rewarding thing I've ever done. Secondly, one of the things that has caused MIDI to somewhat fade to the background is that the concept of recording performance rather than sound seemed strange to many artists, and there were not a lot of instructional voices out there at the time showing folks the power of choice that this could provide them with. Third, the emergence of digital audio workstations that recorded sound and provided a means of editing that sound seemed more familiar and intuitive to many artists and producers. And thus, it became a preferred way of recording rather than using MIDI. The important thing here is that it's not an either-or choice. You can have both MIDI tracks and audio tracks in a recording, and in fact you almost always do, as your lead vocal tracks are going to be audio tracks, not MIDI tracks for the most part, unless you want some kind of fancy effects. However, it is possible to have MIDI-generated harmony and backing vocals if you wish. It's always your choice. Sometimes it's nice to have MIDI orchestration, and then you just have your natural acoustic guitar or an actual piano, depending on what instrument you actually play. So mixing audio tracks and MIDI tracks really gives you a wide range of choices and results in really nice recordings. The important thing is it's always your choice, and you can make the best use of that only when you know what your choices actually are. So now let's take a look at an actual MIDI-produced song. So when I write a song, like many singer-songwriters, at first it's just me and the guitar, and I compose the song primarily just with myself and the guitar, working on the chords and the melody and the lyrics, and refining the song. And then eventually, when the song is quote-unquote finished, I then think about how does the song need to be produced to best present it. Is it going to be lightly acoustic, or do I need a full orchestra, or do I need some kind of world instrumentation, or heavy metal, or hip-hop, or techno? And I think about what is going to be best for the song, and I have all those choices. I don't have to worry about budget or getting musicians or instruments, because it's all self-contained in the MIDI system. All I have to do is think about how I want to produce it, and all I need is the guitar, and I can make the song be whatever is best for the song. So as an example, I'm going to use a song here that I wrote using the metaphor of all the world being a symphony orchestra. So of course that lends itself to a lot of orchestration. So at first I wrote the song just on the guitar, and I'll show you what it sounded like originally, just me and the guitar. And there's an intro, a verse, and a chorus. I'll just do the intro, verse, and chorus. I won't sing the lyrics, so you can just hear the music, okay? Intro, verse, and chorus, and this is called Rhythm of Our Heart. So there you have the intro, verse, chorus. And so when that was all done, I started thinking about how am I going to orchestrate all this. And so here in the intro, you can hear there's basically two parts that just jump right out. There's the so that first part, the clearly bass guitar, that started the bass line, so that became bass guitar, and then that lent itself to various treatments. I used a harpsichord and keyboard layered together with some pads underneath. And then when we get to the verses, there's a bunch of other instruments. Again, in the verses, it's keyboard, because where there's vocal, you don't want to have too much stuff to interfere with the vocal. So this song does have two vocal verses, and then there's an instrumental verse. And in the instrumental verse, we do a whole bunch of things with lots of different instruments. We bring in the French horns and the brass and all of that kind of stuff. Now, in addition to that intro, I also thought, okay, while that's going on, let me add another line. So I did this. Okay, so that line is over the introduction. You'll hear that. And what I did was first time through, I do that as a flute, and then it repeats, except the second time through, it's done as a xylophone. And again, I don't have to do anything except play it, just as I played it on the MIDI guitar, and MIDI will take care of changing the sounds and all of that kind of stuff. And you'll see that in a bit. So we've got the intro, we've got those lines over it, then we go into the verse, and then the chorus. I guess I'm going to show you now what that sounds like when it's put together and translated to MIDI. And just keep in mind that what I just showed you was done on this my acoustic 12-string guitar, but in order to do the MIDI recording, I have to use a MIDI guitar. So I'm going to use this particular one. Later on, I'm going to show you all the different varieties of MIDI guitars that are available. But this is my basic one, and this is what I'm using for doing the input on this song. Okay, so these are the raw MIDI tracks that I recorded one by playing all the parts. And this is the MIDI performance data, which we then edit and we make it sound exactly the way we want. We select the sounds and fix up any mistakes and add in expression. And once we have it the way we want it, we can then play the MIDI tracks and take the output from the sound modules and record them as digital audio tracks. So now we've converted the MIDI data to digital audio, and then we can work with the digital audio tracks in the way that that is normally done. And I think that's an important step that a lot of people don't do, converting the MIDI to digital audio, because if you have a lot of MIDI tracks, that does consume a fair amount of computing power, and it can add lag time on your computer, and by converting it to digital audio, it makes it much easier. But you can do all of your editing and pre-mixing and everything while they're still MIDI tracks, so that basically you can just record them to the digital audio, and for all intents and purposes, it's pre-mixed. So what you're going to see is we're going to play the whole song. We're going to play all the tracks, and you'll see the MIDI tracks running, the digital audio tracks running, and you'll see me playing the parts for 3 different tracks. So here we go.
Every day the horizon rings with the rhythm of the sunlight on a cloud. The surf is singing loud. There's a ray of golden light. It sweeps the sky like the wave of a baton. And the orchestra plays on. All the world's a sea of sound, we're members of the band. The creator's composition, conducted by his hand. We all have a special part. We all have a special part. We make life our own work of art with the rhythms of our heart. Every night, the wind and the water wave up to the stars there in the skies. They whisper their replies with a light that chimes as the water's churning, turning tides that ebb and rise. Each day is a reprise. All the world's a sea of sound, we're members of the band. The creator's composition, conducted by his hand. We all have a special part. We all have a special part. We make life our own work of art with the rhythms of our heart. Sound, we're members of the band. The creator's composition, conducted by his hand. We all have a special part. We all have a special part. We make life our own work of art. We make life our own work of art with the rhythms of our heart.
Okay, so let's talk for a minute about MIDI controllers. In other words, how do you get the data recorded? How do you record the all the elements of the performance that you're doing on the instrument? A MIDI controller is any type of device that allows performance data to be recorded. It can be in any shape, any form, and you can interact with it in many different ways. Most typically you think of a keyboard. Any keyboard with a MIDI output is a MIDI controller, but there are so many other options. Now a pure MIDI controller keyboard has no sound, it's just keys. And the sound comes from some external sound module. But a keyboard that also has built-in sounds, if it has a MIDI output, that's a MIDI controller. But for those of us who are not keyboard players, we have many other options. If you are a guitar player, you have many various forms of MIDI controllers that are specifically made for guitarists. What I have here is a very basic MIDI guitar. This is like, no frills, basic MIDI guitar. This was made by Casio in the 1980s. Still works perfectly today. That's one of the great things about a MIDI system is, it doesn't change. It's a universal language, and equipment that you've gotten 40 years ago is still good today as long as it works. So this is a basic MIDI guitar, just an ordinary 6-string electric guitar, and you can use it as an electric guitar, but it's got your MIDI output here, so you can plug it into a MIDI system and it will record your performance data. This is the MIDI pickup here. On the back you've got, this is the battery compartment. And you've got these two access panels, which most MIDI guitars have. One lets you control and adjust the sensitivity of each individual string, so that some strings can respond more forcefully to a lighter touch or less, depending on what you want to do. And also gives you access to switches that enable you to direct each string to a separate channel, so that you can have, when you play something, you can have 6 individual MIDI tracks, each corresponding to a specific string. So, and then you can assign them differently. So your one string can be a flute, one can be a violin, one can be a French horn, or you can have them all go to one MIDI track. That's totally within your control. So this is just basic MIDI Guitar 101. If you wanted to go out and get a MIDI guitar today, it might be hard to find one like this because they keep adding frills and all kinds of things. And if you want just basic MIDI guitar, you can go to eBay or something like that and get them secondhand. Okay, and another option. This is very similar to the other one. This is also made by Casio in the 1980s, and this is one of my workhorses. I use this one a lot. This is, again, a MIDI guitar just like the other one. It has all the same features, except this one, in addition, it's got a sound card in the back. So if I wanted to use this in live performance, in addition to being a MIDI guitar for recording, I could also use this in live performance and play the guitar and have, you know, violins or keyboards or organs or all kinds of things come out of it because sounds are built in. This is, it's actually a very nice guitar. It's very easy to play. Again, this is about 40 years old and works just fine. Never had any problems with it. So this is another option. Now for those of you who like tried and true, traditional, here's a Fender Strat. This is an actual regular Fender Strat. This was made in the 1990s by Fender. And it's called a Roland Ready Strat because in addition to being a regular electric guitar, there's your MIDI output. All the MIDI output is built into it. So it's a regular Fender Stratocaster, but it is actually a MIDI guitar. And you can use this with any MIDI system to record MIDI performance data. Now this doesn't sound anything like a guitar. Now you might ask the question, well, if you've already got a guitar, is there a way to adapt it so that it can become a MIDI input device? And the answer is yes. So here is an ordinary electric guitar. This is a just basic Yamaha electric guitar. It's not a MIDI guitar, except what we have here is the Roland GK2 pickup, and this pickup can be attached to any electric guitar. This here is the MIDI pickup. Here's the output control, and this is what plugs into the MIDI system. And you can basically convert any guitar into a MIDI input device. So this is yet another option that you have. Now, you also got many other types of MIDI input devices made for guitarists as well. This device, this is made by Casio in the 1980s. This is a full MIDI input device. It's got a whole bunch of sounds available. It's got built-in speaker. It's actually a good performance device. Now, like many of the MIDI input devices that are guitar-based, that are not actual guitars, the strings are not actual strings. They're just sensors, so that it senses motion, so that it knows which string you're plucking. And each fret here is a switch. There's a switch underneath each fret, so it senses where your fingers are. So and it's a good MIDI input device. This is another inexpensive one. So again, vintage 1980s. That concept has been carried forward to a lot of the modern MIDI input devices. So we've got something like this. This is the Zetar from Star Labs. Star Labs, if you look them up, Zetar or Star Labs, they do all kinds of MIDI input devices. This one is all kinds of fancy. You've got here like percussion and all kinds of things for controlling the sound. You've got basically a joystick here. And this is, again, this has the strings that are not really strings. They feel okay when you're doing finger picking or things like that. And again, the frets, rather than on the other one where the switches were under the fretboard, here it's actually, there are buttons when you're, and so each finger position is a button to be pushed. So this does a lot of stuff. And depending on what you want to do, different MIDI controllers are applicable for different kinds of playing. Like there are certain kinds of parts I'd want to perform on one type of guitar that would not lend themselves well to a different type of controller. So, you know, you get to pick and choose. But basically, these are all kind of fancy and esoteric. If you have a basic MIDI guitar, then you're all set, because anything that you can play on the guitar, you know, you can translate to MIDI. The important thing to remember is, if you're going to play something on the guitar and you want it to be like a flute or a violin or something like that, you got to play appropriately. You don't play it as if you were playing guitar. You're not gonna play a flute or you know, trumpet part where you're bending strings and hitting power chords, because that's not appropriate for that instrument. So you want to kind of adjust what you play to match the sound that you're going for. And as you're playing, you can hear the sound that you want, and then you can always adjust it afterward, change it to a different sound, and do your edits and such. We'll get into that a bit later. But now you've also got other choices. So I'm going to show you a couple other things. Now here are some other options. If you are a woodwind player or familiar with sax or clarinet, this is a MIDI controller. Right, here's your MIDI input. This is a fantastic little device. It lets you do single lines, and even if you're not familiar with the fingerings for those types of instruments, you can set the fingering to finger just like a basic recorder, which pretty much everyone knows how to play. Breath control or not. I mean, you don't have to blow into it. You could just press the buttons, or you can blow into it, and it has nice breath and volume control. And this is a really good little input device. This was made in the 1980s. It's a Casio DH100. It was originally designed to be like a little toy, but it is a fantastic device, and they go for a real premium now on eBay. Another option, if you're a brass player, here's a MIDI trumpet. Okay, this has all kinds of sounds built in, and also there's your MIDI output. You can use this to record MIDI performance. It fingers just like a real trumpet, but you don't have to use the embouchure. You don't have to blow into it as you do with a real trumpet, because that's obviously something that takes a bit of training. All you have to do is hum. It will automatically produce the correct note based on the fingering you're doing, regardless of what note you're actually humming. And you've got a variety of sounds here that you can hear, but it's basically a MIDI input device for brass players who are familiar with trumpets. Another option, this is an incredible device. This is called a Q chord, and this is made by Suzuki. It's basically a MIDI input auto harp. If you're familiar with the auto harp, this touch plate, this is like the strings on the auto harp. When you run your fingers across it, it activates each of the little sensors that act as the strings. These are your chords, just like on an auto harp. You press the button, and when you go, you're going to get the appropriate chord. It has built into it, so you can do your MIDI input that way. It also has a built-in bass line and melody line, so you could actually output 4 MIDI parts all at once. But it's a self-contained device. It's got a built-in speaker, so you can use it for live performance as well. This is called Q-Chord by Suzuki. So those are some of the options that you have for getting all kinds of performance data into a MIDI system. Okay, so now let's talk about percussion. So many independently produced songs have little or no percussion simply because the artist either can't afford to hire a good drummer or they don't have the experience working with good percussionists to get the right fit for the song. Not to mention that doing the recording setup for an acoustic drum kit is complex, requiring many mics and a lot of engineering know-how. With MIDI, the world of percussion is at your fingertips. Given that most singer-songwriters are themselves not fluent drummers, there obviously have to be many different ways to do MIDI percussion tracks. First, if you do happen to be a fluent drummer, you can play parts in with a full MIDI drum kit, like the Roland V drums. You don't have the engineering challenges that are there with acoustic drum kits, and you can get any sound you want, but good V drums are sometimes a bit pricey. There are alternative, less expensive sets, not quite as fancy, but they will do the job. Alternatively, if you play keyboard or guitar, you probably have enough hand coordination to use pads. There are many types of pad input devices, like the SPD-20 or the Octapad, which gives great modern hip-hop sounds, or the fantastic Roland Hand Sonic, which has a wide range of world percussion sounds and a very, very sensitive touch response. Yet another option is to use a programmable drum machine like the vintage Roland R8, where you can program your entire song in measure by measure and then have it play that into a MIDI track. And believe it or not, there is still the most powerful input device of all that you all have, your standard computer keyboard. As long as you know in your head what you want to hear, you can simply type it in. Each note corresponds to a specific drum sound, so you can type in the 5 key things, because after all, MIDI data is just data. You can type in which note, which beat, how loud, how long, and any related expression. I've been fortunate enough over the years to have worked with many fine drummers to know the subtleties of percussion instruments and how they are played, so that I can type in complex drum tracks in a short amount of time. I do a lot of work with individual clients in helping them to learn how to create great MIDI percussion tracks, from hip-hop to pop to orchestral to classic rock to intricate indie songs. So that brings us to the wrap-up. I know you still have many unanswered questions, as I've only been able to touch the surface of many topics while going at warp speed. You can always reach me through the contact info on my websites, and I'm happy to work with folks individually to address your specific situations. One final question that I know you all have: what does this all cost? Well, if you've ever gone into a studio to record a few songs or an album project, then for probably a lot less than that, you can have a very robust MIDI system. Or if you have invested in a home studio and you already have a computer, or if you have a digital audio workstation, it's just a short step to add some input and output devices to tap all the power of MIDI that we have discussed. It is really an extremely cost-effective way of getting high-quality productions that are fully under your own control. So if you want to look further into the realm of MIDI, do your research, and if I can be of assistance to you, feel free to contact me. If you want to hear more MIDI recordings, check out my hundreds of songs on any of the major streaming platforms or on YouTube. I have songs from my own many album releases and also from many other artists that I've worked with. There are more free songwriter resources online at songcrafterscoloringbook.com. Whatever direction you choose for your path forward, I wish you the best of success with your music. Thank you for sharing this time with me, and as the great Harry Chapin said to me when I was just starting out, above all, keep writing.